Hello, everyone. Thank you for signing on to this NCRP webinar today, PIMBY, Philanthropy in My Backyard. We're going to go ahead and get started. We know some folks will be signing on in just a few minutes. We're going to go ahead and get started. Just to go through a few logistics, if you have any questions today about technology, please use the chat feature in the upper right-hand corner, or you can email me at bbarge@ncrp.org. If you're using your telephone today for audio, please use a landline. We found that that is a much clearer call clarity. Later on in this webinar, we'll be having an audience Q&A with our panelists. And at that time, we'll invite you to use the Q&A icon in the top right corner. It looks like a little question mark to submit your questions. So no need to worry about that right now, but that'll be something we'll point you to later in the webinar. And this webinar is also being recorded. So a recording of this webinar will be made available at our events page at ncrp.org/events in the days following the webinar. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. We recommend that, well, we encourage you to engage with us on social media. The hashtag for this webinar is PIMBY, for Philanthropy in My Backyard, as well as NCRP chat. You can also engage with us at our Twitter handle, NCRP. Our moderator, Duffy, who is a project associate at NCRP, her Twitter handle is DuffyNDC. And below are the Twitter handles for our other panelists, for Springboard for the Arts, Aspen, LISC Detroit, and so on. And we'll have reminders of these Twitter handles later in the webinar, but we wanted to go ahead and show you these now so that you're prepared. Our presenters today are Tahirih Ziegler, Executive Director at LISC Detroit, Laurie Zabel, Executive Director at Springboard for the Arts, and Sheri Brady, the Senior Associate for Strategic Partnerships at the Aspen Institute Forum for Community Solutions. Duffy, Project Associate at NCRP, will be moderating our conversation today. And we're very excited to have all of these experts on the call with us. To give you a quick overview of the agenda, we'll be doing a quick poll in just a moment to see who is on the webinar. Then Caitlin will provide some background context on the inspiration for this theme and this webinar. Then we'll dive straight into a discussion with some of our panelists, as well as a discussion on national trends. And then we'll really open it up for Q&A. So we're really excited to hear what you all are thinking about this topic and have our panelists respond to your questions. And finally, we will then close things out. So the poll question to get started today is, why are you interested in this topic? So I'm going to open the poll. And you should see the poll in front of your screen now. Choose the option that best represents you. Why are you interested in this topic? You'll have about a minute to give your responses. All right, we've got just a few more seconds, so make sure to get in your response, and then we'll show that in front of the screen for everybody. All right, so as you can see, about 43% said that they're a funder that does place-based work. About 40% say they work for a nonprofit that receives place-based funding or is affected by place-based funding. And about 15% are folks who say they're curious about the funding happening in their community, in their backyard. So with that, I will go ahead and turn things over to our official moderator, Caitlin.
Great, thanks so much, Ben. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our end of the year webinar. I am Project Associate with NCRP and have been conducting research for Philanthropy for about 2.5 years now. And to give some context for our conversation, I'll start by giving an overview of our Philanthropy initiative and place-based grant making. So Philanthropy was launched in the spring of 2014 to maximize the impact of our nation's grantmakers and burst the isolation bubble in philanthropy to deliver honest feedback to foundations. Thus far, we've completed 9 assessments of private and independent foundations, and through the project, we provide actionable feedback to the largest grantmakers in the country to help them improve their practice, specifically looking at their engagement of underserved communities and the advancement of equity and systems change. For the purposes of this webinar, we'll focus on the Kresge and Knight Foundations, but for additional lessons in place-based philanthropy, I would point your attention to our assessments of the California Endowment and the Lumina Foundation, particularly the California Endowment, which is a statewide fund doing place-based work and has a clear commitment to equity and resident voice and power. And so all of our Philanthropy reports are free and publicly available online, where you can also comment and vote on our recommendations. Next slide. Great, so now I'd like to highlight some of the findings and recommendations from the Kresge and Knight reports that are relevant to place-based work. You can read the full findings and recommendations online at philanthropy.org. And first up is our assessment of the Kresge Foundation, which we published in late October. Kresge is a national funder that seeks to improve the lives of low-income residents in cities across the U.S., focusing on health, education, arts, human services, and the environment, and has a specific place-based focus in Detroit with dedicated staff there. Next slide. So some of the main findings we'd like to highlight for the purposes of this webinar are Kresge is a strategic risk taker and public leader that solicits extensive input from grantees to create strategies. It has a strong commitment to ensuring that the most vulnerable residents in cities thrive. And in contrast to its inclusive national work, Kresge is perceived as more top-down and controlling in Detroit. So NCRP recommends that in Detroit, Kresge reach out to more grassroots organizations and support more bottom-up social change, as it has started to do with Kresge Innovation Project grants. Also that Kresge explicitly integrate a racial equity lens throughout its work, as it has with the environment and climate change. Grantees like Push Buffalo, which we featured in our video for the Kresge report, have a strong equity focus to their work. Next. Next up, we have our assessment of the Knight Foundation, which we just released last week. Knight seeks engaged and informed communities in its 26 target cities, funding in the arts, journalism and media, and urban revitalization. Knight partners with community foundations in its 26 cities and employs on-site staff in 8 of those cities. Next slide. So Philanthropy found that Knight is committed to civic engagement and has used challenge grants in select cities to open up grant making and allow more community members than otherwise would have access to its grant making. It seeks vibrant cities by attracting and retaining 25 to 34-year-old college-educated talent. And though there isn't a consistent parallel commitment to economically lifting up existing low-income residents in those places, Knight lacks well-articulated long-term goals and strategies, particularly those to build resident power and advance equity locally. And lastly, the Foundation's pursuit of shiny, bright objects or tech innovations without a consistent equity focus represents a missed opportunity. Some recommendations for Knight's work in its 26 cities include articulate how the Foundation's pursuit of innovation will lead to long-term systemic change. describe how Knight seeks to advance equity, and address local demand for more interaction between community partners and Knight staff and more networking across Knight cities. And lastly, last slide for me. So place-based grant making. We know there are many definitions, many funders who are adopting place-based strategies. These themes are important to talk about not just for the foundations we've assessed so far, but for the sector as a whole. And so here are some ways we can think about place-based grant making in the context of this webinar. So place-based grant making has a geographic orientation with a goal of improving targeted neighborhoods or communities. It focuses on community resilience, vitality, and collaboration, and seeks to involve residents in strategy. In doing place-based grant making, funders work to identify and mobilize local assets and understand the cultural, political, and historical context in a place. So for example, in last year's Towards a Better Place conference report, which was organized by Aspen, Neighborhood Funders Group, and Movement Strategy Center, and supported by funders like the California Endowment, Lumina, and Knight, the report's authors write, place-based grant-making strategies seek to improve the lives of residents in neighborhoods experiencing entrenched intergenerational poverty, racial discrimination and profiling, and disparities in education, income, criminal justice, health, housing, and other areas. So for all of these reasons, the grantee and community perspective is vital, which is why we're excited to hear from Tahirih and Laura today. So why don't we go on to the next slide, and Tahirih, can you start us off by telling us about your organization?
Sure. Thanks so much for allowing me to be a panelist today. The mission of LISC is to help residents transform neighborhoods, and how we do that is in two forms. Really bringing the art form of community engagement along with the business side of investment in neighborhoods. And we're all trying to create good places for people to work, do business, and raise children. And we have a five-prong approach, which is our Building Sustainable Communities approach. And that's really related to our expanding in housing and other real estate, but then also being able to invest in charter schools, financing, also related to working on projects that include health clinics. And so we've been working in Detroit for about 25 years, and that work has really resulted in about $200 million of grants, loans, and equity. And those particular projects are really targeted in 5 neighborhoods, and each neighborhood has a quality of life plan, and those particular plans really give the framework to provide the opportunity for investment, not just for LISC, but for other investments and investors that are interested in working in Detroit. So 2 neighborhoods are in southwest Detroit. One is a primarily Hispanic neighborhood, and another neighborhood is adjacent to the Central Business District. There's another neighborhood that we're working in northwest Detroit, which has been a historically strong neighborhood, but was negatively impacted by foreclosure. We're working in a neighborhood that's just above Midtown, and with that particular neighborhood, it's key because it is located in the center of the city. And the last neighborhood we're working in is northwest Detroit, which has had very little real estate investment, but a higher concentration of children and returning residents.
Great, thank you so much, Tahirih. Laura?
Hi, I'm Laura Zabel. I'm the Executive Director of Springboard for the Arts, which is based in Minnesota. We define Springboard as a community and economic development organization that is run by and for artists. And our work is really focused on building a reciprocal relationship between artists and their communities. And we kind of look at that through 2 lenses or 2 buckets of programming. One are direct services that help artists make a living and a life, so programs that increase artists' financial literacy, help artists build entrepreneurship and business skills. We have a very large healthcare program and are a navigator for the health insurance exchange, physical resource centers, all of that kind of programming that directly supports artist ability. And when I say artist, it's a really, really broad definition. All disciplines, including a particular focus on disciplines and artists who are traditionally or historically left out of the kind of nonprofit arts ecosystem. The other side of our programming is programming that helps communities engage with artists and sort of tap into the resource and the power that artists can provide. And that looks like programs that are kind of community organizing approach to creative placemaking, training for artists and support for artist projects, and capacity building for community and economic and other place-based organizations to help them think through how they might engage artists in their work, how artists might be an asset in their work. Our work is really place-based. We're based in Minnesota, and we have work and an office in the metropolitan area of the Twin Cities, and we also have an office in a rural community called Fergus Falls, so we see our work both through an urban and rural lens. And then we have a national platform where we share tools and resources for people to replicate or adapt things we've done here in a place-based way for their own communities. And we really see all of that work as about building systems that help artists become more visible and valued in their communities and help communities access creative thinking around some of their big challenges and opportunities.
Great, thanks for those introductions from Tahirih and Laura, hearing about your work in Detroit and Minnesota. So when a national funder is interested in working in your locale, how do you think that they should approach your community?
Well, I think it really goes back to some of the basics around collaboration and cooperation with community stakeholders and really agreeing to a certain blueprint that the neighborhood has visioned for a specific community. I think also all of our challenges, whether you're a funder or an intermediary, are sometimes based on getting the authentic kind of involvement and engagement to community development transformation. And so not all organizations that we support look like the communities that they serve, and so really making sure that our investments are community-based is sometimes a challenge. And so I think one thing for a national funder who wants to come into a market like Detroit is really looking at the stakeholders and getting very close to the ground to hearing what's needed in the specific neighborhood.
Yeah, I would, of course, agree with all of that. I think particularly for foundations or funders that are outside of a community, making sure that they have systems that help the community define success for themselves. So I think that's a particular challenge because you want to have some sort of parallel ability to look at your investments across a whole portfolio, but I think particularly in place-based work, making sure that success looks like what the community says success looks like, and that may or may not be what it looks like in another community is particularly important. I also think as a funder enters a community, it's really important to think about how to sort of help a community lift up what works and share that definition with other people, and how to help a community take some of those early little bets before maybe they have a clear way to articulate exactly what works. I was at a workshop yesterday and someone used this great phrase, instead of evidence-based practice, we need more practice-based evidence. And I think that's a great way of framing place-based work especially.
So Tahirih and Laura have spoken a little bit to how ideally you'd like to see this work done in your community. Can you talk about a time when you felt frustrated by your interactions with funders investing in your community and a time when you felt encouraged?
Sure. So a very specific example of a time I felt frustrated, we do a lot of, like I said, this sort of community organizing approach to making, and that really is about respecting and recognizing people who are already in a community as the creative leaders of that community, and that work, our outcome in that work is always around the relationship between artist and community. It isn't really about a specific art object that gets produced. And one time a funder asked me if I was worried that we would decrease property values by creating too much bad art. And my answer to that was no, I was not worried about that, although maybe I should have been encouraged that this person felt that the arts had that much power. But I think, to me, more than just the comment, what's frustrating about that is that, to me, it was about the thing I was talking about earlier, about sort of wanting to be able to see all of their portfolio through one lens or through one measure of success, when we were, in fact, pretty clear what our measure of success was and how we were measuring that, and it didn't have anything to do with sort of quote-unquote good art. Much more often, though, I think we've had really wonderful and supportive relationships with grant makers, particularly around the place-based work. And I think some of the sort of hallmarks of the really great partnerships we've had have been grant makers that have really invested in the time for us to do place-based work. So rather than just sort of single one-time or one-year support, being able to talk with us about a longer commitment to the work so that we, in turn, can make commitments to partners, I think is really important. And then the other thing that I think is a real trademark of a lot of our sort of closest funder relationships is the opportunity to be in conversation and in contact with their other grantees across the country, and to be part of a sort of national conversation around what place-based work looks like across sectors or within sectors. That I feel like is a really unique advantage and opportunity that national funders can bring to work that can feel sort of, you know, you sort of have your head down in your own community, and so having those opportunities to lift your head up and understand more about what your work looks like in a national context and learn from other colleagues is really great.
Tahirih?
Yeah, you know, I would just add that when you're thinking about the work in terms of, it kind of just made me think as she was talking around metrics and just around maybe having more community-based metrics and being a part of that metric making, and to make sure that funders are able to meet their outcomes and milestones. And I think having more community organizations involved in that metric is really important.
So Tahirih and Laura, for you and your community, how would you like to see foundations acting as an inclusive partner, especially when it comes to non-traditional leaders? What would a culture of mutual respect look like to you to really involving the community and some of the processes you've been talking about?
I think having an inclusive strategy, but also infrastructure is really important. And I go back to just a little bit on the metric side, because some of the inclusiveness can be determined by what a community may want to see happen. And so that may be a metric. Maybe they'd like to see more development happening on the finance side, but like to see more actual developers that look like people that live in the community participate in that process and get financing for a particular program. So I think, and projects. So I think really making sure that inclusive, what the term means for a certain community, is articulated by that community and then included in the funders' agreements with the community.
I think that this work, to be really successful and to have that kind of mutual reciprocal partnership with funders and other partners all sort of starts with a relationship-based approach. And I was thinking about the sort of beginning of the slides for this webinar had this lovely quote about how some people look for a beautiful place and other people try to make a place beautiful. And I think actually in this case, what leads to the best relationships are people who look for the beauty that's already in the place. And the leaders that are already in the place, even if they don't look like, you know, how or aren't recognized in a sort of traditional way. And that is a strategy that takes time and curiosity and a sort of willingness to look for and find and support leaders that maybe don't work inside organizations or aren't the sort of traditionally recognized leaders. And so that's hard because it's a slower approach, but I do think spending that time investing in finding the beauty that's already in the place, finding the leadership that's already in a place, even if it's sort of scrappy or looks more like a wild grass prairie than a beautiful garden, I think is an important part of building those early relationships and the early trust that then can really lead to those really fulfilling and successful partnerships and relationships, because the investment is you can see the investment traveling through the community and having an impact in a good way.
These are valuable insights. I hear you both talking about having people that look like the community involved, really getting the involvement of people in a place. So from an equity standpoint, how would you like to see funders define success in your community?
I think, you know, Tahirih had some great examples of making sure that work is led by people who look like the community and people who represent and have real relationship and are in right relationship with the community. I would also, something that's sort of a through line, and maybe I've sort of said this in different words already, but I would like to see more place-based funders define success as that kind of capacity building or relationship building rather than a sort of single outcome. I mean, particularly in the world that I come from art and culture, often funders define success as this piece of public art or this plaza was developed, and pay less attention to this set of relationships exists in the community now, or this set of people now have the capacity to work together and the ripple effects of those relationships will continue, or this new kind of leadership was built in a community. And I know those are the things that are harder to get our arms around in terms of metrics and evaluation, but I think for place-based work, those really are primary to the sort of physical development is the capacity of the people in the place and the power and agency that is in a place, that I think place-based projects and place-based funding really have the potential to support and make more visible and increase.
And I would agree with Laura. I think moving away from the single transaction, focusing on more investments that really consider the entire community and looking at multi-layers of development, even from cultural, social, or economic kind of support. And I would agree, looking at different types of leadership and different types of leadership building within a community.
Oh, you could not hear me. Was I muted? I apologize.
No,
Could you read my lips? So I was saying how I really hear Tahirih and Laura talking about how you're defining success in your community with national funders as relationship and capacity building rather than just a single outcome, moving away from just one single outcome or transaction and looking at considerations of entire communities and the power and agency in a place. So another question for you both. what kind of risks would you like to see foundations who are investing in your community taking? Would you like to see the funders and funding in your community take risk?
Yeah, I think maybe, you know, that all depends on how you define risk. But one, I think, thing that is sort of risky, particularly for national funders, and particularly for funders who because of their own capacity, need to sort of fund at large scale. One risk I'd really like to see, either on their own or through intermediaries, I feel like the world of place-based work needs more opportunity to take little bets and for people in a community to try out small projects before they have to sort of meet a threshold of, you know, multi-$100,000 investment, but what, you know, project in their own neighborhood are few and far between, and I think that's one of the ways that we build capacity and build new leadership is by giving people the opportunity to try something out without the kind of high stakes of you know, this project has to speak for the entire community and you've got a huge investment from a national funder and all eyes are on you. I think place-based work is something you only learn by doing it, and so having opportunities for people to really, for people in a community to take some risks and to build the relationships they need through doing things is something I really believe in and something that I think would be a really big risk for a national funder to be able to support that kind of infrastructure or work with a partner on the ground to make sure that they aren't just sort of continuing to recognize the same 6 leaders in every community, which are usually wonderful leaders doing wonderful place-based work. But I think if we're going to kind of get beyond that level and really do the leadership and capacity building that we've been talking about, people need opportunities for fast and simple experiments.
And I think in Detroit, just looking at the work that's really around population stabilization, really from programs and projects that support existing residents who've lived in Detroit, but also really trying to support also programs and projects that bring different demographics back to the city. I think it's really important having that dual investment strategy as a funder, a national funder. And then I do agree with Laura about having investing in small impact projects that have great impact. Maybe they are on a smaller scale. And I think just having a dual investment strategy on a lot of levels is really important to meet the needs of a neighborhood and community.
Thank you, Tahirih. Thank you, Laura, for your insights. We'll have some other opportunities for you to give some comments and thoughts at the end, but I wanted to give some time now to turn it over to Sheri, who is Senior Associate for Strategic Partnerships at Aspen Forum for Community Solutions, who's going to talk to us about national trends. Sheri?
Hi, Caitlin. Can you hear me?
There, and I see you too.
Okay, good. Thank you. And I'll just tell you a little bit about the Aspen Institute Forum for Community Solutions, which you can see there. But we grew out of the White House Council on Community Solutions, and our mission is really to support community collaborations that enable communities to effectively address their most pressing challenges. And we seek to do that by being a platform for sharing best practices across community collaborations through documentation and lifting up of community success stories and successful models, mobilizing stakeholders, advocating for effective policies and change, and catalyzing investment. And our first effort at catalyzing investments, the Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund, where we fund over 23 local communities who are investing in creating pathways for youth to work and to opportunity to work in family. Sorry, I just hear a little background noise. I wasn't sure if it was something on my line. Sorry about that. And so we really just think that there's an opportunity to really spotlight community success stories and inspire other folks to act. So we really try to do that and focus on collective impact and collective action and bringing it to the next level. So that's a little bit about the forum. So great. This was really an interesting conversation, and a lot of the things that Laura and Tahirih talked about were sort of trends that we've been noticing in our conversations and in our meetings with funders, as you talked about the Towards a Better Place conference that we had last September with NFG was really the start of some of our work in this conversation, and we've had some follow-up webinars and conversations focusing on different aspects of place-based work. But some of the sort of trends and best practices that we've really been looking at echo some of the things that were said earlier. Really thinking about funders are realizing they have to get rid of that short-term investment mentality if we really want to have effective change in a place. We really need to be thinking about long-term investment, because part of that is it really takes a lot of time to build the trust. And the trust you need to build within the community, not just between the funder and the grantee, but the funder, the national funder and other local funders and the grantees amongst themselves. We're really learning, as we look at sort of a lot of trends that are happening, things like collective impact and collaborative approaches to policy making, that a lot of that is built on trust, and you've got to take time to do that. And so some of that can take 2 to 3 years to get all the partners at the table, you know, to really trust each other and to realize that that they all have the best goals in mind. It's not just sort of thinking I'm going to get mine and then walk away. So that takes some time. Really thinking about the skill sets that you want for a program officer and an officer who is the person who's leading the work in place. Do you want them to have some organizing skills and network building, not just be issue experts, but really think about how they come to a place with familiarity and context and connecting and having cultural competency, because you really want them to be a trusted outsider or even an insider who's been there and from there, but can be a real conduit back to the foundation. And that goes to approaching the work in the spirit of collaboration, not just being a grant maker, but being a co-learner and a change maker, and really thinking about coming to it with community, and don't think that you have all of the answers when you get there. Really thinking about how you're savvy and smart, and being willing to step back and listen and not just learn. And that also helps, we talked a little about the relationship building, but also thinking about how you then deal with issues of power, race, and trust when you come to a community. Acknowledge the power that you hold as a funder when you come to the table. Lay all the cards on the table and recognize that there are power dynamics and trust dynamics that are existing within the community that you're going to. And really, how do you acknowledge that and how do you deal with that? That also helps with understanding, when you understand the context of the place that you're investing in. I believe Laura talked about this a little bit in some of her comments. And really thinking about how do you analyze and know what's really happening, and not just investing in the same 6 or the same 3 that seem to be the stars. And I'm using a little finger quotes, which I hate, but you know what I'm saying. And thinking about how you do the analysis of that, because you want to invest in real leadership and building the pipeline and capacity, because you have to think about sustainability, and not just when you lead as a national funder in your connection with the community there, but also when these leaders sort of age out, or when they start moving on to other things, because often a lot of these local leaders sometimes get tapped to do other things. What's the pipeline look like when you come to a place and thinking about that? Because you don't want your leader to leave and then have to start again in the middle of your initiative and project with someone who has sort of had no context or no connection to the work that's going on. It's really understanding what those are and investing in leadership versus just gatekeepers. Funders should also coordinate amongst themselves, really thinking about if you're a national funder going to a local place, what are the local funders doing? And use the local funders as the experts that they are, because they're part of the community and they've been investing in a lot of this stuff for a long time. Don't come in and think that you automatically get it. And local funders should really be willing to be that conduit and to be that connector, because they're often the ones who are left picking up the pieces when national funders pick out. They have to continue to fund in this place and make the place livable and be there. And this is also something that was mentioned both by Laura and Tahirih. Align the funders' goals with local priorities and think about your unintended consequences. The goals that you want, and I know that funders also have people that they're accountable to, boards and trustees, and they want to make change, and I think they have the best of intentions, but really think about how those match with what actually the community actually says it needs and needs. So going with your listening hat on versus just your talking hat. Really. And one of the big unintended consequences that we've seen a lot is sort of this displacement. You go to a place, you look at D.C., how much these neighborhoods in D.C. have changed. You build there and you have gentrification, and then people who have lived there for generations can no longer afford to live there. That's a real something serious you have to think about, and how you do this in a way that doesn't have that kind of impact on the community that you're coming in to work with and to help them solve their own problems. That's just creating a greater set of problems. So these are sort of conversations and trends that the funders that we've been talking to have been thinking about. The people who have been coming to our meetings and having these conversations have been talking about. So I'm glad to sort of expand on anything that you have questions for, or if folks have other questions.
Great, thank you so much, Sheri. Yeah, and I definitely encourage people to remember the Q&A option is there. If you have some questions that came up during our conversation with the panelists or now with Sheri, we'll be getting to those. Sheri, thank you for that fabulous overview of national trends, and I really like this best practices list you have here. And I wanted to ask you, I mentioned earlier in the introduction and my slide about place-based grant making, the conference that you all held last year, Towards a Better Place. I really enjoyed reading that conference report and the resource list. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that, and if you could point, where would you point people to learn more about these best practices?
Great. Yeah, the conference was a conference that we had, as you said, with Neighborhood Funders Group last September. We're actually doing a Toward an Even Better Place, as Steve calls it. That won't be the title, but next September, in 2016 as well, so information will be coming out, and I'm glad to share that. But really, it grew out of this idea of a conversation that we had with some of our funders for Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund that I mentioned. We had local funders and national funders in the room, and there really was a tension about from local funders talking about national funders really swooping in and thinking that they suddenly have the answer, whether it be around collective impact or collective action, or whether it be about opportunity, youth, and investments there. And local funders are like, we've been doing this work for years with our communities. We've been working to create these collaborations and these partnerships and have been investing a lot of time and effort into it. And then you suddenly come in and you're like, I have the answer, and not really approaching the local funders to learn about and to learn the landscape. And so that's really what it grew out of that conversation. And the meeting that we had was really a chance for people to really sort of put these issues on the table and talk about the lessons that they've learned, the concerns that have been raised with them. We had national funders, regional and community funders there. And you can find the report for people. They can find it on our website, which was on the beginning slide, but Aspen communitysolutions.org is our website. And it really lists out some thoughts of lessons learned and best practices that this list was pulled from, and some resources for where you can go to get more information on that.
Great, thank you so much, Sheri. And I believe next up we're going to be having an audience poll. I'm turning that back over to Ben.
Hi, everyone. Yes, so instead of doing a WebEx poll, we invite you to just share with social media. So as you've been thinking today about what's been discussed, how do you think place-based funding should be done to lead to equity? We're really curious to hear what you think. And so towards the end of the webinar, we'll check in and see what folks had to say. But yeah, we want to hear your thoughts because we know there are a lot of responses to this question. So as you have that in mind, we're also going to go ahead and move to our Q&A portion with the audience. So as we mentioned up front, if you look in the top right-hand corner of your screen, you should see the Q&A button. It looks like a question mark, and feel free to submit questions there. We've already had a few questions come in already, so continue to do that. And we encourage you to submit those in now. So we'll give another minute for you to submit those. And while you do submit your questions, as we gather those, we did want to go ahead and give you a quick update about upcoming NCRP events. So if you've enjoyed this webinar so far, we'll be doing 2 more webinars in January. One will be looking at mass incarceration from a rural perspective, looking at the impact of those dynamics in rural places. We'll also be doing a orientation for our nonprofit members of NCRP. And January 5th through the 22nd, we'll also be accepting nominations for our Impact Awards, which are ways that we celebrate foundations that are doing exceptional work to move the philanthropic field forward and really support equity. We'll also be having our civic engagement issue of our Responsive Philanthropy quarterly journal come out in February. And we'll also be having a big debate at the end of February asking how should U.S. philanthropy be responding to refugees. So as you can tell, there's a lot of work coming up, and we hope that you'll tune in to all of those. Continue to enter in your questions. The first one, though, we'll go ahead and get started, and Caitlin, I'll let you direct this to whoever you like. One question we have from Tom is, he said, I haven't heard anyone mention local community capacity. What expectations or hopes do you all have for the community capacities being built and left behind after a national funder leaves?
Well, I think that to the point around community capacity, that there are opportunities for national funders to come into a particular area and build that capacity with an organization, but as they move their energy or resources to other opportunities or places within a city, there are local entities that could also play a role with maintaining that capacity moving forward. I think also community organizations do have to demonstrate that they have the ability through their transitions, and it's a very fragile environment sometimes with community development, with staffing transitions and those types of organizational issues, to maintain their commitment to the neighborhood and really making sure that a funder understands what their next steps are and what their plan is for a particular community outside of the organizational changes.
Yeah, for me, this question sort of goes back to and recommends a strategy that it does measure itself based on the amount of social capital or social connection that's built. I think that in terms of building the capacity of the community, for me, one of the most important things that can happen from investment in an individual project is that people have the opportunity to build the kind of relationship muscles to work collaboratively across sectors or across organizations, and in particular, the kind of social capital between neighborhood or place-based organizations or individual people in a neighborhood and their public and civic leaders, making, I think that's a role that often a national funder can help facilitate. How do those connections get made? How do the voices in the community get heard? And how does a community build its capacity and its agency and confidence to communicate with their political and policy leaders? And then how do you help those policy leaders see the community as the expert and see the community as the leader? I think that kind of relationship building is exciting to me as a potential outcome of a period of investment from a national funder.
Well, I think that goes to, I would agree with that, and just add that I think it's a part of investing where you have to make sure that relationship building is a part of the project that you're investing in. And also, how are you building the civic infrastructure in a place so that you can have all voices at the table, or you can hear from as many voices as possible and invest in that. So I think that's a key piece, that it's not just about the project. It's about sort of all those things that go into making a project, including relationship building that need to be resourced and invested in.
Great. Thanks for that question from Tom. Thanks for your thoughtful responses, Sheri, Laura, and Tahirih. We have about 6 more minutes. I'll try and fit in a few more questions. We've been getting some great responses in the Q&A, so thank you to our participants. I have a question that I'll direct to Sheri, but Laura and Tahirih, feel free to chime in as well. Sheri, we have a question from Tony, and he says, existing institutions, community foundations, intermediaries, community development corporations, often have their own barriers to grassroots leaders and local activists. So how can national foundations work around those barriers?
That's a great question, and I don't know if I would say work around necessarily, but I think how they can help ease some of that. I mean, one of the things that national funders bring to the table really is the idea that they can serve as a convener, because if they have meetings, people will come. And so how do you use that power to help smooth some of those relationships and open some of those doors that your grantee can't open his or herself or the organization self because of existing relationships? I'm not saying that you have to keyhole things in or force things, but really you can serve as that convener and say, we have sort of, we're here we want to invest in a place and we want to have a cross-sector, cross-collaborative process that's going on. How do we get these people at the table where the difficulties in really investing in helping to be that person who can bring those together to have that conversation? Or if they feel that the power dynamic is too great, bring in a neutral or a consultant from outside to come in and help bring those together and facilitate it, to have a facilitated conversation, because they want to be as successful as possible. So how do they then serve that, use their convening power and convening role to bring people together to really have some honest conversations and break down some of those barriers?
Great, thanks, Sheri. Laura and Tahirih, I have a question from Kelsey. Just for time's sake, I'll move on to another question. Kelsey says, some say that place-based funding upsets the natural evolution of cities and communities, and it may offset the larger order of things by preventing overall regional progress. Do you think about this at all in relation to your work? Do you have some comments there for Kelsey?
I guess I would say that, I guess you could say that about any outside investment in a community. And I guess in terms of that question, I tend to be a realist, and I'm more interested in working with, the resources and the system that we have. I think it can, or it can be really useful accelerant or support for local leadership. I think, like I talked about earlier, the opportunity to help communities connect outside of their own borders is a tremendous asset that national funding can bring in terms of cross-pollination and sharing models. So yeah, I guess it's a thing that you should think about and be intentional about how you're investing in a community and all of the things we've talked about so far in terms of investing in supporting sort of organic momentum and local leadership. I think that's how you mitigate against the kind of potential downside of that kind of investment.
And I would just add to Laura's comment around resources being scarce, but also the opportunity that other resources bring when you look at more of a regional approach. And maybe if cities and counties and townships can work better together to bring those resources around certain issues like transportation and transit, or education or safety. Maybe there's opportunities there that we could leverage.
Great. I have a question here from Kate, who asks, what are the roles of funders in supporting and catalyzing community organizing related to the Black Lives Matter movement? Panelists, feel free to chime in, but I just want to recommend in response to that question to check out the Funders for Justice Collaborative, and also NCRP recently had an article in our journal, Responsive Philanthropy, called Moving Money, Making Change, Funding the Movement for Black Lives by Amaretta Morris. So I encourage you to find that on our website under Responsive Philanthropy. So panelists, feel free to chime in on that if you'd like. But Alfredo asks, in a similar vein, how do you bring up race equity internally in community?
I'll just add really quickly another example for people to look at. Obviously, in Minneapolis, everyone has probably read about us in the news, and the chapter of Black Lives Matter Minneapolis has done some incredible community organizing on the ground, is led by a really engaged and energetic group of primarily young female leaders. And recently, an organization, a foundation here called Headwaters Foundation for Justice, launched a fund called the Emergency Fund for Black Lives that essentially is a mechanism where the public, individual members of the public can support the capacity building and leadership of that group, and they're specifically named. And I think there's a lot more about that to say, but I think as an example, it's a way that a foundation has found to be really responsive, really fast, and to support the movement building in a way that is what the people involved in the movement want.
Yeah, and Hill Snowden here in DC has also launched some work around investing in leadership of Black Lives Matter movement, leadership of Black-led organizations, and really building the capacity of these leaders to be effective advocates and to be effective change agents. And I think that that's a really good model to be investing in, as we've been talking about building capacities of communities and building capacities of leaders, and thinking about sort of that bench strength and that way that you sort of build longevity in that. And so I think that's a really good model as well. And as for bringing up the race, and Charlie, that's a hard question. And talking about race is never an easy thing, and I think you just really have to lay it on the table. Often talk about the communities that you're dealing with, and that most of the changes that we're trying to solve with a lot of this work are deeply entrenched and have come from a place of deeply entrenched racism, sexism, other kinds of isms and other kinds of work that are built into the structure of what you're trying to change. And so you have to have that conversation and acknowledge it. And I think it's going to make people uncomfortable. You acknowledge the uncomfortableness, and then you sort of dive into it. It's not easy, and there's never going to be a perfect moment or perfect time to do it, and it's never going to necessarily be the most optimum, and you just have to be honest about it, raise it, and jump in. It's been my experience with it.
And I would also agree. I would just add that as funders are thinking about this type of equity work around race, is really articulating it, like Sheri mentioned it, and really intentionally designing programs and projects that have that are specifically for people of color. And I can just give one example of an entrepreneurial program here in Detroit that Kellogg is working on. And I think there are some other competitive type products that are available for small business development, but really calling out that this program is for people of color, I think speaks to that equity question and issue.
Thank you. Well, in the spirit of time, I know we're getting close to the end, so I'm going to turn this over to Ben before we do our final call to action and closing comments.
Yes, thank you, Tahirih and Sheri and Laurie, for sharing your thoughts, and for everybody weighing in on their questions. I also just wanted to thank the people who weighed in over Twitter. In responding to this last conversation, Brady Lee said that it's really important to talk about race, power, and class within foundation structures, and being co-learners with the community. Kyle Erickson said communities need to have the space to define what equity means to them, and all in community must have a voice in that decision. So it sounds like folks are really echoing what you all have talked about today. So I'll turn it back over to Caitlin for the call to action and closing thoughts. Oh, Caitlin, I think you're muted.
You all are going to be professional lip readers after this. Great. I apologize. So thank you again for joining us. Help us lift up this conversation about what place-based national funders like Kresge and Knight do well and what they can do better. To start, you can vote and comment on our findings and recommendations for these two reports online, and tell us who we should Philanthropy next. I apologize we didn't get to, I think, about two of the other questions that were asked about evaluation processes in place-based work, and also funding small projects and backups if those fail. But to close out, I'll ask Sheri, Tahirih, and Laura, do you have any final comments or thoughts to share with participants?
Sure. I just think that this work of investing in communities that are marginalized takes an enormous amount of art and business investment, and always as we try to be fair and equitable, as we're trying to transform communities, it really is about juggling agendas, and providing a process for consensus for community investment.
Just say I really appreciated being part of this conversation and appreciate that so many people are interested in thinking about this place-based work and thinking about doing it with intention and with a values-based approach. And I would just say that I think a through line through everyone's comments today is that there's no substitute for the actual human relationship, and so I wouldn't let a sort of fear of whether things are going to be perfect or whether you're going to have the perfect set of partners on the ground inhibit you from building those relationships and finding a way to support great work.
Yes, and just quickly and say that I agree, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Jump in, and if you tell people, you're honest with people that we're sort of learning as we go along with it, people will be understanding, and I think people will really come to appreciate that and be at the table with you. And as I said, we're going to do a continuation of our Toward a Better Place meeting in September of 2016, and I'll make sure that NCRP has the information that they can share with their network as well. We really want community voices to be a part of that as well as funding voices. So thank you.
Great. Thank you to Sheri, Tahirih, and Laurie for helping us lift up the community perspective and best practices in place-based grant making. Thank you to all our participants for joining us today and submitting your thoughtful questions for our Q&A. We look forward to continuing this conversation with you on Twitter and to staying in touch with you through some of our upcoming events. So thank you. Happy holidays from all of us at NCRP.